Welcome to Securing America with me, Frank Gaffney, and a very special edition of Securing America it is. As you know, of course, our country has been under assault for months, and unfortunately next week's election is unlikely to be the end of such widespread civil unrest and violence. I'm hoping that we're wrong, but we're going to share with you some evidence that suggests that there's much worse to come. And we've assembled an extraordinary team of former officials and other experts to forecast precisely what is coming next and what it will mean for our constitutional republic and its people. Our first guests are former National Security Council official Rich Higgins, former CIA undercover operative Charles Sam Faddis, and the chairman of the Committee on the Present Danger China, Brian Kennedy. Gentlemen, thanks so much for joining us. I'd like each of you succinctly to answer this question. Based on what we have seen in the run-up to this election, what is your best professional judgment about what you expect will happen after November 3rd? And will it matter who is the winner that day? Rich, let's start with you.
Frank, I think we need to look at, there'll be three clear scenarios that we have to consider. I'll call it the possible election of Joe Biden, which would represent the hard left turn of the American body politic, something similar to what we saw in Venezuela or perhaps Cuba 50, 60 years ago. I think most likely course of action is a engineered crisis that will prolong the vote count and allow what we'll call color revolution tactics to be utilized, and an information campaign launched internationally to try and push President Trump from office. And then I'll call the third, which is the most dangerous course of action, which would be President Trump's victory actually spawns, as per John Podesta's Transition Integrity Project, a secessionist movement to be born inside the United States. Those are the three scenarios I think we're looking at.
We'll be drilling down on each of them in the course of this very full hour, I know. Brian Kennedy, let me talk next, because you have been involved in some wargaming of your own, not unlike, I guess, what John Podesta ran with his Transition Integrity Project. Talk about what you found and the scenarios in particular Rich has talked about.
Yes, we called it a simulation, of course. It was the Claremont Institute working with the Texas Public Policy Foundation and policy experts from around the country looked at some of what John Podesta and the Transition Integrity Project was doing, and then came up with our own scenario, which was, as Rich was saying, the engineered Trump victory, which really just means a Trump victory. Election day, President Trump wins. It's a pretty clear win in many ways, but there are a few states in dispute. Those states that are in dispute really have a lot of legal challenges. It's presented in such a way that a crisis then ensues. It ensues because the polls show Biden winning, but then you have a clear Trump victory. The same groups that have been rioting and protesting around the country, BLM and Antifa, they'll continue to do the kind of rioting we're seeing. But then you'll have all these legal challenges that goes to court. And at the end of the day, in our simulation, President Trump came out victorious. That was called the 79 Days Report that can be found on Claremont.org if any of the viewers want to read more in depth about that.
Okay, Brian, thank you. Sam Faddis, it's good to have you here in the studio. So these are scenarios. We don't know which of them will eventuate, but one thing seems to be a common denominator, and that is there will be more violence, more insurrection, or even revolution. Is that how you see it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think instinctively the American people, sort of a matter of common sense, they think election day is going to come and go, and then somehow everything's going to calm down. The folks that are engineering the violence in the streets are crystal clear. They say it out loud every day. They are planning now for the fact that the election day, as my friend Rich Higgins says all the time, is just a mark on the wall. It's a mark on the calendar. It's irrelevant otherwise, right? Maybe the way that violence looks on the day after election is slightly different depending on who wins, but only in the sense that they might give Biden a brief pause before they begin to lower the boom on him. Nothing ends on election day.
Just tease that out a little bit, because one of the things that presumably would cause people to think, well, this is all going to be taken care of because the left will get its way if Joe Biden is, in fact, the victor. Why would the revolutionaries continue to agitate or engage in mayhem?
Right. Well, this is one of the things that, of course, gets lost in the atrocious job that so much of the media does covering this, because they don't address what the actual demands of these people are, which are not just Joe Biden gets elected. They are fundamental socialist, Marxist change. Well, no matter what Biden says, he can't really accommodate that. I mean, maybe at the point of a gun. So that it is the beginning for them. It is the end of nothing for them.
Okay. Rich Higgins, back to you. When you look at what these folks have been doing, and I understand that despite the essential news blackout, there's still an awful lot of violence taking place around the country, obviously in Philadelphia at the moment. But would you anticipate that what we've seen so far is really just a dress rehearsal for what these folks have in mind?
From an unconventional warfare standpoint, we haven't seen any of their guerrilla forces in the field yet, right? The violence has been very limited, targeted direct action, some assassinations, riots. I think what I'm most concerned about is, where the auxiliary is on the ground, on the field, and they're, burning stuff down, and their underground is operating inside these institutions. They do have a guerrilla force. What that is, and are we collecting the intelligence, the information we need to be able to actually assess what that is? And then the big question of all, right, who's paying for all this?
We're going to come to that in just a moment. Brian Kennedy, very quickly to you. When you ran these scenarios, was there any question about how will order be restored in the event that this kind of breakdown takes place?
Well, that's the harder part, isn't it? That will the American left decide that it's actually lost here? And only a clear Trump victory really, I think, demoralizes them to the point where they don't come out and continue. But Americans still believe in law and order. They believe in the Constitution. And I think there's going to be a real demand to bring things back to normal from the chaos we've seen this year. But
it certainly does seem as though the fastest way to get there is with a very clear landslide that can't be stolen. Next up, thank you to you all. We'll be talking more with you momentarily, but we're going to drill down next on what makes an insurrection a color revolution, and what will that mean for all of us? Right after this. Welcome back. Our conversation in this special edition of Securing America continues about the color revolution that Marxists and others seem intent on unleashing on the rest of us after next week's election. To discuss what such a revolution entails, I'm very pleased to welcome back Sam Faddis, former CIA undercover operative, as well as a former Joint Chiefs of Staff intelligence officer, Steve Coughlin, and a former Trump National Security Council official, Michael Anton. Gentlemen, it's so good to have you with us. I'd like each of you to answer this question, if you would. What exactly is a color revolution? And what makes it so dangerous for a country like ours in a time such as this? Michael Anton, what are your thoughts?
Or maybe with the implied backup threat of force, but that takes place without the enforcement of the military. So, getting rid of an elected leader without the government buying propaganda, dominant media, street protests, general strikes.
Michael, if I could interrupt you, I think we're having some audio problems. If we can correct those, let me come to Steve Coughlin, and we'll come back to you, if I may, in just a moment. Steve Coughlin, I know you've been studying the color revolution phenomenon closely for quite some time. Particularly talk about perhaps its most successful one in Egypt, if you would.
Well, thank you, Frank. I think it's important to know that going all the way back to 2006, we used to brief the famous quote from Carlos de Jackal that only an alliance of Marxists and the Islamist movement could bring down the United States. And I think that that's what we've been seeing. Now, of course, in the United States, the left is playing the lead role and the Brotherhood is playing support. But in Egypt, it was the Brotherhood led. And so we saw, for example, El Baradei, who was not a brother, but was still supporting it, maybe coming from the international side and the left. And he made a direct reference to the fact that the revolution wasn't working well, and they needed to use the French Revolution as a model. And clearly today, we see in the streets of Washington, including right in front of the White House, guillotines being posted everywhere and imagery of the French Revolution all over the place. One of the major quotes that we see coming out of Tahrir Square is the people want to topple the regime. And then we go to 2015, and we had Nihad Awad say, Black Lives Matter is our matter, Black Lives Matter is our campaign. So
He's with the Council on American Islamic Relations, a prominent Muslim Brotherhood front group. Yes, indeed.
Exactly.
So Steve, let me just interject here because we're going to be running out of time very quickly. Do we have Michael Anton back properly? Good. Michael, back to you. Tell us about the genesis of this term, the color revolution, if you would. And again, what makes it so dangerous here?
The genesis of the term goes back, at least in my awareness, goes back to the early 2000s when similar operations were being mounted in Eastern Europe and in states of the former Soviet Union. And if you were a street protester or a person identified with the revolution, with change against the sitting regime, you signaled your identification with a color. So you would wear this color, you would wave flags in this color, the street protests and so on. So the one that really burst the concept into public consciousness was the so-called Orange Revolution, which took place in Ukraine around 2000 and either 3 or 4. My recollection is a bit off there. But that was it, because they wore orange clothes, orange neckties, orange jackets, or they waved orange flags. Other color revolutions have taken place in other countries with different colors behind them. The only other thing I'd want to add is these things can take place sometimes with foreign support, although that's not necessarily the case. It is often the case that there is a foreign actor lurking behind the scenes using domestic proxy forces to mount this effort, but really for the interests of that foreign actor. That's not always the case, but it's sometimes the case.
Also, one other quick point. Peaceful revolutions are sometimes how these folks have preferred to portray themselves, but it's not always clear that it will stay that way or that it actually is all that peaceful. Talk quickly about that, if you would, Michael.
Well, there's the color revolution is the preferred model because it does look like peaceful change. It can be sold as peaceful change. Grassroots, the people rose up, they took to the streets, they demanded change. There was no violence, change happened, everybody's happy. This really worked out. Often, though, there is an implied threat of force behind it, which is to say, if you don't give us what we want from these peaceful means, we'll have to go to plan B.
Yeah. And that guillotine business, as Steve Coughlin says, is a very troubling sign, needless to say. Sam Faddis, let me come back to you. When you have served in the CIA around the world, you've confronted some of these operations and have a firsthand appreciation of when they work for good and when they can be very, very problematic indeed. Talk about your experience and how that bears on what we may be facing here.
Yeah, well, one of the things that strikes me all the time, Frank, is that I see people in the streets in the United States and they're using slogans, and they're using banners, and they're using symbols. And I am transported immediately to 30 years ago on the streets of Athens, Greece, or name any other capital. Like, this is literally happening in the streets of the United States, what we have seen in terms of Marxist revolutions all across the world. The other thing I'd throw into the mix on the color revolution business is that it is a focus on colors and symbols and images and a deliberate lack of focus. This is intentional on what the actual ideology is. So you get people revved up in Ukraine because generally this is warm, fuzzy democracy. You're not necessarily telling them exactly what you have in mind. Now, maybe in Ukraine what you have in mind is good. In a lot of other places, like in the United States right now, what you have in mind is much less palatable.
Right. And what we saw in Egypt with the brother coming to power.
Exactly. This is not democracy. This is theocracy.
Indeed. And Steve Coughlin, as you look at this complexion of the color revolution that seems underway at the moment, and have they adopted a color here in the United States just yet? It seems to be mostly black as far as I can tell. But is that malevolent threat of violence now more present in this case than in some of the others that you've studied?
Well, I would like to say that some of the things we picked up in the Tahrir Square event was the fact that there was violence. It was just off the radar screen and not reported. And I think we see an enormous amount of violence in the United States calling it as peaceful. In fact, the peaceful protest masking for violence came out of the Tahrir Square. I would be one of those who would dissent from the idea that these things are homegrown movements. They're intensely international in their orientation. And I think we see that. We see there's always the threat of mass violence, and there's the promise to bring mass violence. And we keep looking to the interior. I think Sam Faddis has got it exactly right. This is image driven, and it's important to capture the images because the images are what communicate things. I would say that
Steve, we have to pause. We're going to be right back with more specifically on who is behind this coming color revolution and what we can tell about the nature of it and what they have in mind for our country as a result. That and more straight ahead. Welcome back for our continuing conversation about the color revolution that seems to be in the offing. And we're going to discuss next who's behind this prospect. For that purpose, I'm very pleased to welcome back our National Security Duty Officer, former now, Rich Higgins, and former undercover CIA operative Sam Faddis, and Trevor Loudon, the author and filmmaker of Enemies Within. Gentlemen, again, thanks for joining us. So please explain, who are the apparent prime movers behind this color revolution, and how do we know that? Trevor, let's start with you.
Well, if you look at the people on the street, the people that are going to do the marching, the occupations, the strikes, and all of the stuff that goes with a classic color revolution, most of this is being orchestrated through communist groups that are connected to the Venezuelans and the Chinese. And I'm specifically referring to Communist Party USA, Liberation Road, Freedom Road Socialist Organization, and even to a degree, Democratic Socialists of America. So they are mobilizing the unions, they are mobilizing the people in the streets, and they have deep ties through groups like the Chinese Progressive Association and others with the Chinese government and also the Venezuelans, Cubans, etc.
This is really stunning. You're saying that there is evidence of direct ties, organizational, obviously doctrinal, but also financial, between, say, the Chinese Communist Party and the people who are trying to bring about a Marxist revolution in this country? Trevor?
Well, for instance, Black Lives Matter is very closely tied into the Chinese consulate in San Francisco through a group called Asians for Black Lives, which is led by people who run the Chinese Progressive Association, who by their own admission run their messaging past the Chinese consulate, have very close relationships with the Chinese consulate, send people to China, and are working in China's best interest. So, Freedom Road Socialist Organization has sent 5 delegations to Venezuela this year alone.
Wow.
That's
I guess what they call Sam Faddis in the intelligence business a tell, or a clue.
Yeah.
Are you seeing this in your study of the operatives on the ground involved in the rioting to this point as well?
Absolutely. Absolutely. This is exactly what's happened. And another one of these things just gets buried by so much of the media, unfortunately. We have a true Marxist revolution in the streets of the United States. We have money being funneled to them, and the principal groups here are Marxist. And that's not a throwaway term. I mean that in the literal. These are communist groups that want to transform us into a communist nation.
And they're self-avowed in that regard, are they not? Yes. Sam, you've touched on this point, and I think it's really important, Rich, for you to help us drill down on. How is it we're not more aware of the nature of these organizations, their leadership, their purposes? This would seem to be something that ought to be front-page news across the country, and yet not so much.
Well, Frank, I mean, as you know, some of us have been aware of these groups for years, 5, 6, 7 years now. I think part of it is they do a very good job of covering up their actual roles. For example, you see groups like the Sunrise Movement or the Pacific Northwest Youth League. These are hard, avowed Marxist groups that are right now targeting children and younger generations. And I think the other piece that we see, and we haven't spent much attention on it yet today, is the role that the media giants and the social media community play in this. This insurgency, this insurrection, this communist movement is only able to take place because the media and social media giants allow it to happen. And while we see censorship and narrative attacks coming against conservative, patriotic Americans, on the other side, they are supported and amplified with the megaphone of the social media giants in particular, pushing this rhetoric and growing their movement within these younger demographic sets. It's a really frightening scenario.
Yeah, and it's fair to say, I think, Rich, is it not, that just as they are promoting, in effect, the cause that they favor, they are also suppressing information that might be pushed out, well, by people like us about the nature of this threat. It's sort of the two pieces, sides of the same coin, perhaps, but the tech giants, most especially, seem to be hard at it, no?
Frank, it's so important that we get our arms around this problem. The Bolsheviks were only able to take over Russia in 1917, 1918 because they controlled the trains. And today, the hard left controls Silicon Valley. It controls your perception. It controls your Google searches. It controls what you're allowed to know and how you perceive reality. It's a very frightening, very dangerous situation we find ourselves in.
Indeed. Trevor Loudon, you've made it your life's work of late to drill down on the political figures in places like the United States Congress, in governors' offices, mayors, and so on, who are hard leftists as well. Talk about the role that they've been playing in this sort of first stage of the color revolution, and what you would project will be their role going forward after the election.
Well, I'd like to give two examples. The Department of Homeland Security released its annual report recently and focused entirely on the tiny problem of white supremacy. And while, pro-Chinese communists are burning American cities, there was not one mention made of Black Lives Matter or Antifa. But the head of the Homeland Security Committee in Congress, Benny Thompson, has a long time history with communist groups. He went to Cuba in 2000 and negotiated with Fidel Castro to give scholarships to hundreds of young Americans, free medical scholarships in Cuba, many of them the sons and daughters of Communist Party members. It's a safe bet that many of those young people were involved in the recent rioting.
Trevor, we're going to need to pause here in just a moment, but I did want to make sure that we just emphasize your enemies within book and movie document in copious detail these ties between Democratic leaders, some of them committee chairmen, some of them are people who are, as I say, in governor's offices or mayor's offices, people who have to this point been resisting efforts to restore order in some cases. This is a huge problem, and we're going to talk more about the mission that seems to be the central organizing purpose of all of these folks for the color revolution and what it will mean for America if they succeed. You're not going to want to miss this. Stay tuned. Welcome back for the fourth segment in this special edition conversation about the color revolution that appears to be in the offing. Joining us again is former National Security Council official Michael Anton, Committee on the Present Danger of China Chairman Brian Kennedy, and behavioral scientist and president of the New American Frontier Center, Anne Sorock. We appreciate each of you joining us, of course. We've learned a lot so far about the coming color revolution and those who are mounting it. But I do want to make sure we understand, what is the objective of this revolution and how do we know that? Anne Sorock, you've been doing some deep dive research on this subject. What does it tell you?
Our research is with the foot soldiers of this revolution. These are not the operatives. It's with the people who have adopted what the operatives are selling to them. And what we're finding is that they're looking for a total revamp of society because of the poverty they are surrounded by. They view this as the solution that will give them community, will give them hope. They describe being saddled by enormous debt, for example, education debt, and seeing no way out. And they have bought into the fact that this is the pathway out for them. And what we see is a total confusion in their minds about what is truth. So we have heard before in our society, we hold these truths to be self-evident. These truths are no longer self-evident for them. They view socialism and communism as a way to secure freedom, for example, and they view patriotism as being wrought through overturning society, and they say they are for overturning and starting a new socialist society. They are for a coup.
Yeah. So, Michael Anton, you've written a very important piece about the coup. Expand on that, if you would. Do you agree that ultimately the objective is the fundamental transformation, as Barack Obama used to put it, of the United States of America into something that most of us wouldn't recognize, and I doubt very many of us would want to live in?
I think for some of them it is, but for some of them, the fundamental transformation already took place or got about 80 or 90% of the way there, and Trump represents a reaction that they consider dangerous. And so for some, the elites, the oligarchs, the tech, the finance oligarchs, and so on, we've talked about in earlier segments, to them, the aim is to go back to the status quo ante pre-Trump and then resume course toward neoliberal oligarchy. And I personally believe there's something of an unstable coalition between the people attempting to pull levers and controlling the resources at the top and the forces that they've unleashed on the streets. I don't know that the people at the top have quite as much explicit control over the people on the streets as they would like to have. And which makes the prospects for the future exceptionally uncertain if this gets out so far outside of their control that they unleash waves of violence that at a certain point they would like to rein in but find that they can't.
Yeah. We talked earlier about color revolutions that really were peaceful, but I think the arc or trajectory of most, and Steve Coughlin's reference to the guillotine being placed outside of the White House, among other venues, is a reminder that these things do generally get out of hand and wind up literally removing the heads of those who helped instigate it. Brian Kennedy, talk a little bit about how that history may well be playing out here, and this phenomenon of people who, really will ultimately have opportunities if they stick with the American system, the constitutional republic, and surely won't if it winds up becoming a socialist enslaved society.
Well, that's certainly true, Frank. Look, so much of this, though, is a reaction, isn't it, to President Trump and the fact that he is going against the globalist agenda that's dominated American politics and political life for the better part of 40 years. President Trump put America first, and in so doing, really established in the public mind that we were moving away from globalism. And I think that caused the kind of political war that you saw in the first 4 years of his presidency, where you see this ongoing plot to remove him, a kind of ongoing coup to harm his presidency. And so the color revolution we've been talking about is simply a continuation of that. The American left knows that if Trump and his way of thinking wins out, that it will be very bad for them. They don't want the American people believing in their own self-interest. They would rather have this globalist point of view continue to dominate, which is why you see all the forces on the left arrayed against President Trump. And that's why they see this as a political war that they have to win.
Brian Kennedy, let me just stick with you for a moment. You've spent a lot of time in the think tank world. You ran the Claremont Institute. You're very familiar with conservative and Republican politicians. We haven't talked about them to this point. They seem to be largely AWOL in this fight. If there is a revolution coming, you'd think they would be aligned with Donald Trump and working to support him, and yet not so much. Am I missing that?
No, I think you're right. With the exception of a few heroes out there, Devin Nunes, Jim Jordan, and others, Tom Cotton, most everybody else has been on the sideline or carping for no good reason. It turns out in politics, the thing you really need is courage. And not many of our even Republican politicians have the courage to stand with President Trump. They're looking for a time in the future when he won't be there, whether it's 4 years from now, I hope. And they're looking for that point in the future.
And Sirach, very quickly,
they're not standing up here makes no sense.
Yeah, very quickly, and we've got 45 seconds. Do you sense that those Republican leaders are missing the will of the people in this context?
Absolutely. They are not exhibiting courage, and the people are saying they want leadership. That's why they've responded to President Trump. They want truth-telling in this moment of chaos. And I have to say that the people who are on the streets in the coup, they are also going to come to a fissure with their operative leaders, because they still are telling us they want an America that is good. And so we have the opportunity to still speak to those coup participants.
And we have to. We're going to talk for one more segment about the problem, specifically the techniques that the color revolutionaries will be using to try to achieve their goal of destroying our country. And then the final segment, we'll talk about what we must do about it. And that is going to be where, of course, you all come in. Stay tuned for the conversation about the techniques that we are going to be confronting in the post-election moment right after this. And we're going to drill down now on the techniques that these color revolutionaries can be expected to use to achieve their agenda, their mission of taking us down. And joining us for that purpose are independent filmmaker Jeremy Siegel, a former speechwriter for President Trump, Dr. Darren Beattie, and Enemies Within expert Trevor Loudon. Let's start with a clip out of your new film, Jeremy, entitled Interview with the Left, which can be found in its entirety, choosefreedom.io.
We need to start getting serious about organizing, and building power and building the infrastructure we need to shut down. A political revolution will happen when people start organizing outside the system.
It's up to us to carve out a different future. That's why we say revolution.
We need people that are actually organizing in the streets, creating crises for the decision makers.
Creating crises for decision makers. So, Dr. Beattie, let's start with you. What do you think the American people should be expecting to see from the Lisa Fathians and so on as they mount this revolutionary activity?
Well, that's a great question, and it's one of the advantages of knowing that this is indeed a color revolution, as has been exposed very early on by Revolver.news. I encourage everyone to follow Revolver for updates on this. The two chief characteristics of a color revolution are an engineered contested election scenario, which we see developing before our eyes, and massive acts of civil disobedience, quote-unquote peaceful protests. You see the same playbook being run Eastern European countries. You see it in Belarus. You see it here. What you have are a number of organizations, Color of Change, Move On, labor union groups. They've got them all teed up to flood Washington, D.C. with possibly hundreds of thousands of people to create chaos as we're in this intermediate period where they claim we still don't know who won the election. That's what you get from this mail-in ballot scenario, is they're moving the locus of democratic decision-making away from the polls and onto the streets and the courts because they can't win at the ballot box.
Yeah, and of course what we've seen, I think to most of our horror, is that period of time when those ballots are going to be counted is extended day by day by day by the Supreme Court and others. Trevor Loudon, talk a little bit about how this fits into the larger Marxist doctrine and the techniques that that doctrine calls for as well.
Yeah, well, look, I'm monitoring all of their websites. The major communist groups, Liberation Road, Communist Party USA, Democratic Socialists of America, are working through their control of the labor unions and specifically the state sector unions, the government unions, to create major shutdowns in the period straight after the election. Their rationale is this: the only way Trump can declare himself a winner is if he cheats. Therefore, they are there saving democracy. They're going to go on the streets and shut everything down, cause shortages, cause a weakening in confidence of the president, and completely isolate the president if they can, to the point that even the Republican Party deserts them. I'm not saying that's what will happen. That's what they're trying to make happen. So President Trump has virtually no option but to stand down. The communists are heavily involved in this color revolution. The entire American left is involved in this.
Yeah. Jeremy, let me talk a little bit about that film that you made. It's very impressive. A lot of great sort of undercover work. Lisa Fathian is just obviously one example of the organizing that is taking place. Based on your experience inside the wire, as it were, what do you anticipate will be the role of violence in this revolutionary activity? Is it going to remain peaceful? Is it going to remain sort of civil disobedience? Or will we, in fact, see them engaging in more of what we've been seeing a bit of already?
Well, you're going to see violence. We always do in a lot of these left-wing protests. But we have to remember people like Lisa Fathian and her counterparts are people who are masters of deception. And so what they do are called black bloc demonstrations or black bloc tactics, where they take over an entire city block. They antagonize police and create confrontation with police. They burn that block down But when you go around the corner, things may seem relatively normal and people drinking coffee at Starbucks. What they do really effectively is draw the media in, draw the cameras in to create a perception of mass revolution in the streets. It causes a psychological effect on people who are not part of it and who are not there to believe that they're much larger than they really are, and to believe that their movement is far more effective and on a much grander scale than it is. And it's an extremely effective tactic.
Yeah. And as we were talking about in one of the earlier segments, to the extent the media chooses not to, in fact, cover the parts that are more peaceful, but to focus on the parts that are more demoralizing for the public. That plays a big role as well, I'm sure. Darren, let me ask you about one piece that we haven't really drilled in on. Earlier, Michael Anton, I think, talked about the fact that there's the threat of the military behind these color revolutions, sort of resolving it in favor of the revolutionaries. You've worked for Donald Trump in the White House. You've seen, I know, close at hand, the rather uncertain role that the military in this country seems to be prepared to play to, well, for example, enforce an insurrection act against these revolutionaries. What's your take on how that looks right now, if you could, very quickly?
In the broadest terms, my take is this, that this speaks to a terrifying development within our body politic, and that is that increasing swaths of our national security apparatus are being repurposed and redeployed domestically to silence, censor, and destroy the energies associated with Donald Trump's victory in 2016.
That's troubling, to say the least, and I have the feeling you're right. This will only encourage and embolden those, whether in the Democratic leadership circles or whether they're on the streets, or they're watching all of this play out in living rooms across this country and may feel threatened personally and directly, even in the suburbs, or may simply be watching their country being torn apart and wondering, where are the authorities? Right. Where are the good guys? Right. Where are the people who are going to be protecting our country? We're going to take one last break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about what can we do about this coming color revolution to prevent it from tearing our country apart. Stay tuned for that. Welcome back. We're going to wrap this special edition of Securing America, focused on the coming color revolution, by posing to author and strategist J.R. Nyquist and former NSC officials Michael Anton and Rich Higgins this crucial question. Now that we know about the color revolution headed our way, what can we do about it? Jeff Nyquist, let's start with you.
Well, we need to shine the light on them. We need to not accept their camouflage of racial injustice and environmentalism. This is what they used to try to intimidate people to get us to go along with their program. We need to call them out as Marxists and to point out that they're following out of a Marxist playbook. And you notice that on the internet, whenever this is brought up, they try to censor us when we try to call them by their proper name. And like a cockroach that scurries out of the light, they want to be in the darkness. They want to be in their camouflage.
Michael Anton, camouflage is a great means of capturing what's going on here, because obviously if the true intent of these guys were understood, I think the vast majority of Americans would be horrified and wouldn't want any part of it. Beyond exposing that, what do you believe the American people need to know and do now about this coming revolution?
There's a window of opportunity and hope here. I'm usually not the person in a conversation such as this to offer hope. I'm usually the pessimist, but let me offer some. You mentioned my article, The Coming Coup, posted on The American Mind. All I did was summarize and quote things that they deliberately said and put out into the public eye. Now, why did they do that? Usually, if you're running a conspiracy like this, you want to keep it a secret. I think they did it fundamentally for two reasons. One was they needed to communicate their side. 100 people can communicate in secret, but when you need thousands and hundreds of thousands of people to be in on an operation, that's hard to do in secret. You need to get the message out. The second thing is they were trying to prepare the American people for an unprecedented spectacle, the possibility that the president might have to resign after street protests, or might even have to be walked out of the White House by armed federal agents or even the military. And they wanted
Second Airborne.
Yeah. They wanted to get in the public mind in advance that if you see this unprecedented thing happening, you need to accept that it's his fault. We're not doing this. We're reacting to what he's doing. Once it was exposed, you notice they've been relatively quiet about this for the last few weeks and even months. I think the exposure harmed them, and they realized that it hurt their plans, and they thought, okay, it's time to shut up. So the more exposure that can be made, the better, but also keep the message that, look, American people, when you see this happening, they're going to tell you this is Trump's fault. You need to understand it isn't Trump's fault. He is being set up as a victim of a conspiracy.
Rich Higgins, like Michael Anton, you worked for President Trump on the National Security Council staff. In fact, you wrote a famous memo on the subject, the title of your new book, The Memo. Talk a little bit about what this is going to require of us beyond understanding that we're dealing with folks in camouflage and understanding that they are telling us some of what they're doing to demoralize us and to legitimate what they're up to. What do you recommend we do about this coming color revolution?
Well, I'll boil it down to there are two really hard, tangible things I think need to happen. Number one is you, as you've become aware, and Mike Anton, I think, did a great job of describing that phenomenon. You're watching the show. Share this program with others. Let others know. And really importantly, let your Republican politicians know that you're aware of what's coming. The second thing, and this is really important about the color revolution phenomenon in general, is the lack of communications capability and the ability to shape your perception of events is going to be turned up. We've seen the propaganda and the narrative shaping operations that have taken place over the past couple of years. Multiply that by a factor of 10. And I'm talking Twitter shutdown, Facebook shutdown, communicating with others is going to be very difficult. So any plans you want to make in terms of mobilizing, if you're going to put peaceful protests of our own out on the street, do that now. I'm not saying go out there with weapons or anything like that. Maintain a very strict rules of engagement. They're trying to entice us to violence. It's very important that our side maintain the moral high ground throughout this entire, whether it lasts weeks or months or however long it goes. Remember, Tahrir Square in total lasted almost a year. So we could be going into some pretty choppy water here. But, again, one of the most important things that you could do is honestly share this program today.
Well, thank you for that, and I hope they will. This audience, I think, gets it, and the more people are exposed to the kind of information that our terrific experts have been providing, the better. Let me come back to you, Michael Anton. When you look at the prospect that the United States military may not play the role that they would statutorily be required to if given legal, lawful orders, for example, to ensure that order is restored. Or you look at the really dismal performance of the FBI, for example, to date. How do the American people bring pressure to bear on those authorities to perform and do what they're commanded to do by the commander-in-chief?
Well, first and foremost, if you know anyone in the military, active duty or retired, and I know lots of them, I've been talking to friends of mine in the military and saying, look, if you hear talk of this going on in your ranks, or you feel like you're getting outside pressure from, flag officers that have retired or calling you or whatever, tell them no. Tell them you take your oath to the Constitution and to the country seriously, and you won't do it, and encourage your peers in the military to do the same. And I think instilling that sentiment in the American people is very important. I've been making this point a lot lately. The U.S. Army formally predates the existence of the United States of America. It traces its ancestry to 1775. This is one of the oldest institutions in our country. Does anybody in any way affiliated with the U.S. Army want to sully the glorious legacy of George Washington, the American Revolution, the Civil War, the World Wars, etc., with something like this? And I hope that every serving and former officer says, in the final analysis, if they get such pressure, I cannot and will not be a part of that.
Amen to that. We have to close this really extraordinary conversation. I hope there will be many more with each of you individually. And I hope that in the meantime, those of you listening will learn more about the coming color revolution and what you can do to protect your family, your community, and country by signing up at securingamerica.tv for a downloadable PDF of a new Citizen's Handbook entitled Are You Safe? I think you'll find it indispensable. My thanks to you for watching, and I hope for sharing this show, and to all of our guests for their great help in securing America. There are too many to name. They've each rendered incalculable service prior to this program, and I think in its course as well. I hope you'll take their urgent messages to heart, and that you will then go forth and multiply.